All right, let's jump right into it. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the world of Europe-China business negotiations, a topic many of you have been asking about. We've got some really interesting sources to dig through.
Yeah, it never ceases to amaze me how often cultural differences can trip people up, even seasoned negotiators. And and the material really drives home that even a small misstep can completely derail a deal.
It's not just about crunching numbers, right? Understanding those cultural nuances can make or break the whole thing. Like in Europe, a handshake can often seal the deal. But in China, that's often just the very beginning of a much longer process.
Absolutely. Our sources highlight four key areas where European and Chinese negotiation styles often clash: communication, overall approach, time perception, and even decision-making processes. And I think a great place to start is with communication. You'll often hear China described as a high-context culture. What that means is a lot is left unsaid.
So you have to kind of read between the lines.
Exactly. You got to pick up on the body language, the tone of voice, even the silences. It's all part of the message.
That's quite a contrast to the more direct communication style that many Europeans are used to.
For sure. In Europe, things are generally much more low context,
Yeah.
which basically means what you hear is pretty much what you get. People are pretty direct in saying what they mean, and sometimes even silence can be seen as agreement.
So, with these vastly different communication styles, how can we make sure our message is really getting through?
Well, our sources recommend sticking to clear and simple language. Definitely avoid jargon or idioms that might not translate well. And probably the most crucial thing is to constantly check for understanding.
Yeah, instead of just assuming everyone's on the same page, right?
Right. Ask open-ended questions. Things like, can you help me understand your perspective on this? Something like that.
Makes sense. It's about making sure everyone's really on the same page, not just assuming. Now, the source material also emphasizes that building relationships, or guangxi, as they say in China, is super important. What does that look like in practice for someone coming from a European perspective?
Well, it goes beyond just typical networking. It's about building really genuine personal connections and trust. Chinese negotiators want to know who you are as a person before they even consider what you're offering.
So it's not just about the business proposition.
Right. It might involve things like dinners, informal conversations, even getting to know each other's families.
So instead of jumping right into the business talk, you might need to slow down a bit and actually invest time in building that rapport.
Yeah, precisely. It might mean incorporating more social events into the negotiation process, sharing a meal together, maybe even visiting a local cultural site. It's all about showing genuine interest in your Chinese counterparts and building that foundation of trust that goes beyond just the contract.
That reminds me of that anecdote from the source material about the Chinese team visiting their Dutch supplier in Amsterdam. They had dinner together, shared stories, and really got to know each other on a personal level. It wasn't about closing the deal right then and there, but more about building a foundation for a long-term partnership.
It's a perfect example. And you know what? Months later, that Dutch company actually ended up landing a second project thanks to that strong relationship they built.
That's pretty compelling. It really highlights the value of playing the long game and understanding that trust takes time, especially in this context. Our sources also talk about time perception as another potential point of friction. Can you talk about how that plays out in Europe-China negotiations?
Well, in China, time is often seen as much more fluid, much more flexible. Meetings might start late, discussions can go on longer than expected. And it's not about being disrespectful. It's because building relationships and reaching a consensus takes precedence over strict schedules.
Whereas in Europe, punctuality and efficiency are often seen as super important. I can imagine how those different views could lead to some real tension.
Oh, absolutely. A European negotiator might see a delay as some kind of stalling tactic, while their Chinese counterpart might feel very rushed and pressured to make a quick decision.
So, how can we bridge that gap and avoid those kinds of misunderstandings?
Well, I think it all starts with setting very clear expectations from the very beginning. Before you even dive into the nitty-gritty of the negotiation, have an open conversation about timelines. Make sure you're respecting both sides' needs. If the Chinese team needs more time for those internal discussions, acknowledge that. And if the European team is working with tight deadlines, communicate that clearly and respectfully. It's all about finding a rhythm that works for everyone involved.
Great point. It's about finding that common ground, not forcing one culture's idea of time onto the other. Speaking of potential clashes, our sources also point to decision making as another area where things can go wrong.
Yes, Decision-making in China, especially in larger companies, is very much a consensus-driven process. You might have multiple stakeholders, leaders, advisors, all weighing in before they come to a final decision.
That's different from many European companies where things are often decided much more quickly, maybe by a single person or a small leadership team.
Exactly. So if a European team is expecting a fast decision while their Chinese counterparts are still in those internal discussions, it can create a lot of frustration and miscommunication.
Patience and understanding are key.
Right. You have to respect the process and avoid jumping to conclusions about how quickly things will move.
So we've covered some of the key cultural differences, but where do we go from here?
Okay, so knowing these differences is a great start. But the question is, how do we actually put that knowledge into practice? Our sources actually highlight 4 common challenges that often pop up in these Europe-China negotiations. Language barriers, differing expectations on pace, those different approaches to conflict resolution, and then also how trust is built.
Okay, let's break down those challenges. First up, language barriers. It sounds obvious, but even with translators, some things can get lost in translation.
Oh, absolutely. A phrase can be perfectly translated, but still miss that underlying cultural meaning. Our source material offers some good tips for overcoming this hurdle. First, keep the language clear and simple. Avoid any kind of complex sentences or jargon.
So keep it short and sweet.
Exactly. That'll help bridge the gap even if some of those finer points get lost. And another important thing is to repeat those key points. Don't be afraid to say it again, just to make sure it really sinks in. And I think most importantly, you got to constantly check for understanding.
Right, so don't just assume everything's clear.
Right. Ask questions like, does this make sense to you? Or do you have any questions about this? Just simple things like that.
Those little check-ins can make a world of difference. All right, moving on to pace. We were talking about how Europeans and Chinese negotiators might have completely different ideas about time.
Yeah, that could be a big one. A European negotiator might feel like things are dragging on, while their Chinese counterpart might feel rushed and pressured. The key here, as our sources emphasize, is patience and flexibility.
Makes sense. You need to be mindful of the other culture's perception of time and adjust your expectations accordingly. So how do we actually put that into practice?
Well, if the Chinese team needs extra time for relationship building or internal discussions, you have to give them that space. Don't push for a quick decision. And on the other hand, if your European team is working under tight deadlines, you've got to communicate that openly and respectfully. It's about finding a compromise.
It seems like transparency and open communication are key in pretty much all aspects of cross-cultural negotiations. Okay, let's move on to conflict resolution, which our sources suggest can be a bit tricky.
It is. Because European and Chinese cultures often have pretty different approaches to handling disagreements. Europeans tend to be very direct, tackling things head on, whereas the Chinese value harmony and tend to avoid open confrontation.
So how do you address disagreements without disrupting that sense of harmony, which is so important in Chinese culture?
It's about finding that balance between being direct and being diplomatic. So instead of saying, this won't work, maybe you say something like, how can we work together to make this even better?
That's a good approach. It shifts the focus from a confrontational me versus you to a more collaborative us working together mindset. And speaking of cultural sensitivity, the sources also mentioned the importance of face in Chinese culture. Can you explain what that means exactly?
Face really refers to someone's public image and reputation. In Chinese culture, it's really important to avoid making someone lose face, like through public criticism or outright rejection.
So when you're dealing with disagreements, you really have to be mindful of how your words and actions might affect the other person's face.
Exactly. Choose your words carefully, focus on solutions, and always keep a respectful tone, especially when you're discussing sensitive issues. It's about maintaining that harmony and finding a solution where everyone can save face.
It's a good reminder that cultural sensitivity goes beyond just knowing customs and traditions. It's about understanding those deeper values. Okay, let's talk about trust building, which is essential in any negotiation, but even more so in cross-cultural settings.
For many Europeans, trust is often built through a legal contract. That document is kind of like the ultimate symbol of commitment.
But in China, it's more about the personal connection, that guangxi we were talking about earlier. The contract is important, but it's more like a reflection of the relationship, not the foundation of it.
Right. Building trust in China takes more than just signing a piece of paper. It's about showing respect, investing time in getting to know each other, and finding that common ground that goes beyond just the business transaction at hand.
So this is where all those shared meals, those casual conversations, and those little gestures of cultural awareness we discussed earlier really come into play.
Exactly. Those actions show sincerity. They show you're committed to building a long-term relationship. They show you see your Chinese counterparts as more than just, a business deal.
It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk. So we've talked about those common challenges, but our sources actually offer some actionable strategies to help us overcome them. I'm ready to dive into those. Research and preparation seem like a pretty obvious starting point, but you'd be surprised how many people jump into cross-cultural negotiations without doing their homework.
You're absolutely right. Research is fundamental. Before you even think about sitting down at the negotiating table, take the time to understand the other culture's values, how they communicate, even their business etiquette. It shows respect, and it can help you avoid some pretty embarrassing blunders.
It's like learning the rules of the game before you step onto the field.
Exactly. And in a context like China, where Guanxi is so crucial, research goes even deeper than just general cultural knowledge. You want to find out about the people you'll be meeting, their backgrounds, their interests, even their company culture. It shows you're truly invested in building a real relationship.
It's like giving a personalized gift, right? You put in that extra effort to understand who we're giving it to. Okay, next up is active listening, which is important in any negotiation, but especially when navigating cultural differences.
It's more than just hearing the words.
Mhm.
You have to really listen for what's not being said, pay attention to body language, ask clarifying questions. You have to really try to get inside the other person's head.
It's so easy to just listen with your response already forming in your mind instead of really trying to grasp their point of view.
Yeah, for sure. And active listening becomes even more important in cross-cultural situations where those subtle cues and unspoken messages can be really significant. For instance, if your Chinese counterpart pauses during a conversation, don't jump in to fill the silence. Give them space to think and formulate their response.
It's about creating space for communication without those assumptions and interruptions. Okay, another strategy the sources emphasize is flexibility and adaptability, which seems especially relevant in these cross-cultural situations where everything is new.
You have to be ready to adjust your approach based on the people and the situation. If they're all about building relationships first, then slow down. Invest in those connections. If they seem more task-oriented, be prepared to move at a faster pace, but always be respectful.
It's about finding that balance. All right, our sources also emphasize the importance of building rapport and trust, which we've touched on throughout this conversation. Do you have any specific tips for how to do that effectively in a cross-cultural setting?
Well, it goes beyond just basic politeness. It's about finding those genuine points of connection, showing a real interest in their culture, and making people feel valued as individuals.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? What are some tangible things we can do?
Well, small gestures can go a long way. Learning a few basic phrases in their language, even if it's just hello and thank you, shows that you've made an effort. Or maybe sharing a meal together, asking about their interests outside of work, expressing admiration for their culture. These might seem like small things, but they can be really powerful.
It's like they say, actions speak louder than words. Now, we've talked about these strategies, but do we have any real-world examples from the source material, to see how these actually play out in negotiations?
Oh yeah, we have a couple of contrasting examples. One is a success story where they really nail these principles, and the other one shows how that lack of awareness can lead to a communication breakdown.
I'm definitely intrigued. Let's start with a success story. What made this negotiation go so well?
Okay, so this source describes a situation where a German company was looking to set up a joint venture with a Chinese manufacturer. But instead of just diving into the contract details, they spent a whole week just having dinners, sharing stories, really getting to know each other personally.
Sounds like they were putting that Guangxi building into action.
Exactly. They understood the importance of building that trust before getting down to business. And what was the result? The deal went through without a hitch. Both sides felt heard and respected, and they ended up forming a really strong partnership.
So investing in those relationships early on pays off in the end. Okay, let's hear about the negotiation that went wrong. What happened there?
Well, in this case, we had a British negotiator who was pushing a Chinese firm for a quick decision. He completely brushed aside their need for consensus and those internal consultations. He was all about speed and efficiency, and he didn't really prioritize building those relationships or understanding their decision-making process.
That sounds like a classic clash of cultures.
It was. And the Chinese team felt disrespected, and they ended up walking away from the whole deal. They just saw his approach as pushy and insensitive.
It's a good reminder that cultural values really matter, especially when it comes to sensitive topics like decision making. Now, this discussion about cultural differences and how to navigate them makes me think about the role of
Oh,
technology.
that's a great point. I
Yeah.
mean, we're at a point where technology, particularly AI, is completely transforming how we communicate across cultures.
That's right. But before we dive into that, let's take a second to really digest everything we've learned so far. And then we can explore the exciting world of AI and what it means for cross-cultural negotiations. Welcome back, everyone. We've been talking about those fascinating differences between European and Chinese negotiation styles and some of the challenges and strategies involved. Now let's explore how AI is shaking things up a bit.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how AI is making its way into cross-cultural communication.
Yeah.
One of the areas where it's already making a big difference is language translation. Tools like Google Translate and Microsoft Translator are getting really good.
That's true. But how effective are they at, capturing those subtle cultural nuances we've been talking about? Like a phrase can be translated perfectly, but still miss that underlying meaning.
You're right, that's the key. Current AI translation tools are great at conveying the literal meaning, but they still struggle with context and subtext. They're getting better, but there's room for improvement.
So it's a helpful tool, but it's not a replacement for cultural sensitivity. What other areas are being impacted by AI?
Well, one really interesting development is the rise of these AI-powered platforms that are built specifically for international business. These platforms can help negotiators from different cultures communicate better and avoid misunderstandings.
That's fascinating. How do those work?
Imagine you're prepping for a negotiation with a Chinese company. An AI-powered platform could analyze tons of data from past negotiations, cultural insights, communication patterns, and then give you advice on how to approach it. Like it might recommend specific phrases, point out nonverbal cues to watch for, or even warn you about potential cultural traps.
Wow, so it's like having a cultural coach right there with you.
Exactly. And these platforms are getting more and more advanced with features like real-time insights during online meetings, analysis of body language, even personalized feedback on your negotiation style. Pretty remarkable.
It's exciting to see how tech can support us, especially in the ever-changing world of cross-cultural communication. But, and I think this is important, AI is a tool. It can't replace human intelligence and empathy.
Absolutely. AI can't do all the work for us. We still need to put in the effort to learn about other cultures, develop our empathy, and build those real human connections, because that's what makes a negotiation successful.
So it's all about finding that synergy between human and artificial intelligence, using the best of both worlds.
Right. And as we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to emphasize that understanding cultural nuances isn't just a nice-to-have skill. It's a huge advantage in today's global business world.
Whether you're working on a big deal or just interacting with colleagues from different cultures, those small gestures of respect, that willingness to listen, to adapt, it can make all the difference.
It's a journey of continuous learning. The more we interact with different cultures, the broader our perspectives become, and we can start to build those bridges of understanding.
This deep dive has been so insightful. I know I've learned a lot, and hopefully our listeners have too. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Keep learning, keep exploring, and keep building those valuable cross-cultural connections.
And to all our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We hope you found this deep dive helpful as you navigate the exciting world of business. Until next time, keep exploring.